Welcome to the second video in this series on portalism. In this video, I describe the general concept of portalism, which is a theory of radical phenomenal externalism lying outside of traditional metaphysical norms. Basically put, there are three critical components to the theory, the first being consciousness, as a fifth fundamental force of nature. The second is the portal, which I define as a biological mechanism through which access into consciousness is achieved. And the third and final component of the theory being mind, manifested as a synthesis of portal and consciousness, the locus of which is entirely extracranial.
Hi, I'm Jeffrey Laird, and I've been developing the theory of portalism for about 2 years now. Before we begin, I think it's necessary to point out that the theory of portalism is not in the analytic philosophical tradition, being closer in resemblance to continental philosophy. Analytic philosophy tends to view philosophical questions as discrete abstractions, placing emphasis on knowledge supported with empirical evidence, its focus being upon the logical analysis of a particular phenomenon. Continental philosophy favors rigorous descriptions of phenomena and the manner in which they conform within the whole of existence. The continental tradition is thematically holistic as opposed to being analytically particular, but it is important to mention that both disciplines embrace clarity and precision, and both have valuable contributions to make. Continental philosophers use phenomenology and hermeneutics as their exploratory tools, while analytic philosophy applies a scientific method. Both can be effective approaches, but the empirical tools and methods that analytic philosophy uses so deftly in the physical world do not appear to be serviceable when the scene shifts to the realm of subjective experience. Since we do not yet have a subjective science to furnish us with the tools and language necessary to compose an empirical explanation of consciousness, the best I can do is undertake to formulate a theory that provides the most plausible answers to the problems that face philosophers of mind. I will endeavor to present and defend a cogent theory wherein my burden is not to prove that portalism is true, but only that it is plausible. Since I have no choice but to work within the linguistic limits of objective morphology, the arguments in defense of portalism will not be deductive and empirical, but inductive and synthetic a priori, which, according to Immanuel Kant, is the only form that metaphysical arguments can take. Thus I will proceed here along the lines of the continental philosophical tradition as I understand it.
All metaphysical theories begin with assumptions. Materialism assumes that the universe is composed of only physical states, wherein dualism assumes both physical and mental states. Idealism assumes that only mental states exist, and that nothing physical exists beyond our perception of it. Materialism and property dualist positions like epiphenomenalism assume that causality flows only one way, while anomalous monism accepts the possibility of dual-path causality. Portalism is no different, requiring that certain assumptions, 6 in fact, must be accepted before the theory can be plausible. What follows are the 6 assumptions of portalism. Assumption 1. A non-physical subjective realm exists, as does a physical realm independent of our perception of it. In the philosophy of mind, the terms subjective and objective are used frequently and can take the form of just about any part of speech. To be sure, anything subjective is in reference to mental phenomena, while the objective characterizes the physical. The subjective realm is the universe of experience. Like the objective realm, it is ontologically irreducible, but unlike the objective realm, it is unbound by space and time, it is indeterministic, unextended, and not subject to the laws of physics. The objective realm is the physical world, the ontologically irreducible universe of objects where everything physical that can be encountered, accessed, and experienced exists. Everything in the objective realm is natural by its being in nature, and is therefore subject to the laws of physics, extended and pinned in time and space. Assumption 2. The mind is not the brain. The locus of the mind is entirely external to, but causally connected to, the res extensa. The localization of consciousness, manifested as mind, is in the world, not in the brain. Although mind is extracranial, it is tethered to the brain in a relationship of existential codependence. Mind depends upon the sensory facilities of the brain to process and disclose objects and states of affairs that it encounters in the world, while the brain depends on mind to find the fuel, shelter, and companionship in the world that it needs to survive. Assumption 3. The horizon of consciousness is a fundamental force of nature and is ubiquitous throughout the universe. It is ontologically irreducible and precedes the distinction between subject and object. Consciousness is the all-encompassing structure that enables the possibility of subjective experience. The horizon of consciousness is devoid of content, it being the subjective ground and not the subject. Assumption 3 represents the fundamental philosophical underpinning of the theory of portalism, wherein consciousness is assumed to be a fundamental force of nature, on a par with the weak and strong nuclear forces, electromagnetism, and gravity. This horizon of consciousness is the irreducible ontological ground encompassing the possibilities for subjective experience. Assumption 4. All living organisms harbor an innate and intrinsic biomechanism capable of facilitating an individual connection, forthwith known as a portal, into the horizon of consciousness. Given a functional portal, individual actualizations of mind are immediate, involuntary, autogenic, and invariable within the realm of living things, and remain so until the portal is closed by damage, disease, a brain-induced act of self-preservation, anesthesia, or death. In so claiming, portalism holds that all biological systems across the zone of life are conscious, at least to some degree. This includes the animal, plant, and protist kingdoms. Combined with the assumption that consciousness is a fifth fundamental force of nature, no other theory of consciousness can make these claims. In upcoming videos, I will argue how this is not only possible, but necessary and unavoidable. Assumption 5. A portal consciousness connection is necessary and sufficient to manifest a localized individual state of consciousness actualized as mind. Such a connection is the necessary condition before any mind can be. Basically, this assumption describes the mechanics of portalism, in which the portal, being a biomechanism that all biological systems have, autogenically accesses, or taps into if you prefer, the ontological horizon of consciousness, creating a state of consciousness localized to the individual, which manifests as a mind. Each mind exists until the portal is closed, for whatever reason. When the portal is closed, the mind dissolves. In the case of injury or anesthesia, the mind is reestablished when the portal reopens, able once more to access memory and intellect which is stored in the brain. But in the case of advanced disease or death, mind vanishes permanently. Let's step aside briefly to address a point that might need clarification. By now you may have noted that portalism semantically distinguishes between big C consciousness and little c consciousness. I borrowed this nomenclature from Martin Heidegger, where he defines the ontological ground of being as spelled with an uppercase B, while the ontic being, the Dasein, is identified with a small case b. So when capitalized within a sentence, uppercase C consciousness refers to the ubiquitous force of nature, that is the all-encompassing horizon of subjectivity and the ontologically irreducible subjective ground, whereas an actualization of mind resulting from a portal's connection into consciousness is described as lowercase c consciousness, this form being the subject. Lowercase c consciousness is therefore synonymous with the terms subjective experience and mind. Assumption 6. Only mind has content. Only minds have the potential to realize experiential content. As consciousness simpliciter, the fundamental force of nature and the enabling horizon is an irreducible ontological ground in and of itself and devoid of content. The depth, capacity, and quality of any agent's subjective experience are dependent upon the sophistication of its portal mechanism, while the all-encompassing horizon of consciousness remains constant as the ontological ground of subjective possibilities. The potential for any mind's experiential content is dependent upon the dynamic potential of its portal connection. As I will discuss in a later video, portalism is biocentric. A portal mechanism through which the horizon of consciousness can be accessed inheres in all biological systems throughout the zone of life. So what do I mean by the term biological system? I use the term to distinguish between comprehensive life forms and individual cells. Thus, the elephant, as a coherent biological system, is capable of subjective experience, but the component cells and structures within the elephant, although they may possess innate behaviors in determining what can be digested or when a bladder needs to be emptied, are not capable of subjective experience in themselves. Neither are they capable of reason or cognition, being only component parts of a comprehensive biological system, in this case, an elephant. To hold that these component cells are conscious would be panpsychism, and portalism is neither panpsychist nor is it cosmopsychism. So, how conscious is the elephant? The elephant is as conscious as elephants need to be.
So the concept of portalism is not difficult to grasp. In fact, its mechanics are elegantly simple. Consciousness is a fifth fundamental force of nature, ubiquitous throughout the universe. All living organisms access this horizon of consciousness through their portal mechanisms, of which I speculate are biological and/or biochemical in nature. This active access is immediate, autogenic, and invariable, entirely necessary and sufficient for the actualization of mind, with nothing else being required. In other words, a living organism with a healthy functioning portal mechanism cannot not be conscious. When a portal mechanism accesses the fundamental force of consciousness, an individual localization of this all-encompassing structure is manifested, which is actualized as mind, mind alone being capable of subjective experience. Mind is tethered to the biological system that actualizes it in a relationship of existential codependence, but the locus of mind is in the world, not in the organism. The sensory capabilities of the organism transmit information to its processing center, which is the brain in the case of human beings, where it processes this information and discloses it to mind. The context and meaning given to those objects and states of affairs is assigned by mind, as only mind is capable of thought and reason. Mind is not an object in the world. Mind is absorbed by the world. It is in and of the world, realized as a de facto relationship of identity with objects and states of affairs in the world, and synthesized as a conscious singularity. As such, there is no representation of the world, and the world is exactly as it appears.
Thank you for viewing this video on the mechanics of portalism. In the next iteration, I will discuss the horizon of consciousness in more detail and present my argument as to exactly how it is a fifth fundamental force of nature. For more information regarding my book, Portalism and Externalist Theory of Consciousness, visit the website shown here. Hope to see you soon.